Welcome back to the Ed Morrissey Show podcast. Joining me is the blog father himself, Instapundit Glenn Reynolds, also a New York Post columnist these days, and of course over at pjmedia.com. My colleague, actually, in the Town Hall group. Glenn, so good to talk to you today. Thanks for coming on.
Nice to be here.
So you've been doing some great work over at the New York Post. I mean, you've got a weekly column going over there. Every single column is terrific, but I do want to talk about the most recent one regarding Joe Biden and Russia, because this is unfortunately becoming even more acute after last week's presser and now with what's going on in Ukraine. You say that Biden acts much more like Putin's puppet than Trump ever did. I completely agree with you on this, but walk us through your column.
Well, in fact, I opened the column with a quote from a 2017 piece by Walter Russell Mead, who's a pretty famous historian at Bard. And in that, he was responding to claims that Trump was a Putin puppet. And he was like, well, let's see, if Trump were a Putin puppet, what would he be doing? He'd be doing everything he could to ban fracking. He'd be trying to shut down pipelines that brought oil into the United States from Canada. He'd be trying to soften relations with Iran. He'd be stepping down nuclear weapons. And basically, my point at the time was, who did these things before? Obama. Who's not doing these things now? Trump. And now, I just pointed out, now Biden is doing all these things. I mean, he's done everything he can to limit fracking, which is one of the reasons why gas prices are so high. He shut down the Keystone pipeline, which would have brought ethical oil from Canada. Ethical oil is what they call oil that comes from places that aren't sleazy dictatorships or terrorist havens.
Right.
It would have been a huge boon not only to the United States, but also to the Alberta region of Canada. And the Canadians are actually pretty miffed about it, and rightly so. He's not just made nice with Iran. I mean, they brought back the John Kerry agreement where Iran pretends not to develop nuclear weapons and we pretend to believe them. When it comes to nuclear weapons, I mean, it's not only that he's pushing some dumb arms treaty. He's not even doing that. He's canceling U.S. programs unilaterally while the Russians and the Chinese are really moving into much more advanced nuclear weapons programs than they've had in the past. And of course, just basically everywhere, the policy is, if you just want to ask yourself, will it weaken the United States and will it strengthen the hand of Russia and China? If the answer is yes, Biden's probably doing it. Now, I'm not saying he's actually a Putin puppet, because honestly, I think Putin could hire more competent help, but he might as well be.
Well, and when you take a look at that press conference that occurred on Wednesday of last week, and the sort of nod to a minor incursion, and it kind of depends on how many units are crossing the border sort of thing. I mean, this is sort of an amazing green light to Putin to do what he did on Donbass, or at least expand what he did in Donbass, which was to create these sort of proxy militias that were really just Russian regulars, go in and seize territory, foment some unrest, claim to be acting on behalf of Russian ethnic Russians, and seizing territory in there, and I mean literally in Crimea and more or less, practically speaking, in Donbass, and that's bad enough. And I mean that happened in 2014 too. I mean people have to remember that this didn't happen during Trump's time. We didn't have the pressure now about invading the rest of Ukraine that we do right now with Putin. That happened in 2014 with Obama and Biden. Now we got Biden back in there, and we're seeing this all over again. And I don't think that's coincidental.
No, I don't think it is either. I think Biden's blurt in his press conference about the minor incursion is probably a reflection that he got a briefing that was what was likely to happen, and people didn't think it would be worth a major U.S. response. And maybe it wouldn't be. I'm not necessarily saying we want to start World War III over Ukraine, but I certainly think we don't make things better by signaling to Putin that we're not going to do anything.
Well, and this is a good point, because there's a lot of pushback, and it's coming from, I would call the far wings on both sides of the aisle, is that, well, The only alternative here is to send American soldiers to die in Ukraine, and I mean we're not going to do that. That's not the only alternative here. I mean there's a whole lot of different things that you can do, including cutting Russia off from the SWIFT program and international banking. You can start producing oil and natural gas here in the United States and drive the prices down to undermine Russia's economy. There's all sorts of other different things that you can do, short of sending troops into Ukraine, which I wouldn't do either. I mean, I'd say it'd be foolish. Not just militarily, it would be foolish. Our lines of communication would be so long and so stretched out, and Russia's would be so short that you're just asking to get your ass kicked. I mean, but this is not an A or B sort of situation. This is an A to Z with all sorts of different alphabet letters in between, right, Glenn?
Yeah, one of the things is you want Putin to not be sure exactly what you're going to do.
Right.
You want him to be uncertain and nervous. If I were the Ukrainians, what I would have done already is infiltrated a bunch of special forces people into Russia to basically go wild against the gas and oil infrastructure the minute the invasion starts, and really bring the pressure home to Putin. I'm told that's the strategy some of the Baltics have had for dealing with a potential Russian invasion. And the Ukrainians have good special forces. They did a lot of very good work when they were alongside us in Iraq, so they probably could. Whether they will, I don't know. What we'll do, I don't know either. And the trouble is, we literally don't even know who's in charge. I mean, it's clear that Biden's not in charge. People talk about Ron Klain being in charge, which is a disturbing thought. But we don't even really know who's pulling the strings in this. We don't know what their motivations are. And while I don't think Biden couldn't be a Putin puppet, because if he were, he wouldn't remember long enough for it to matter. But there may be other people in there who are influenced by the Russians, which would be no great shock. A good chunk of FDR's administration, after all, was very influenced by the Russians, and they see the value in that. So, but we can't even tell. It's not transparent. We don't even know what their policy goals are, really. It does, in the midst of sort of an unprecedented first-year presidential collapse, a war kind of serves Biden's interest, at least in the short term, as a distraction. If people are thinking about that, they're not thinking about how expensive gas is. And, those little "I did that" Biden stickers on gas pumps have gotten so ubiquitous that even NPR had to notice them and do a story on it. And, I saw somebody on Facebook that I barely know saying that she drove from New York to Miami, and every time she stopped, she saw those on the gas pump. So there's like a lot of grassroots sentiment here that they would love to distract people from, and a war is pretty good for that. And it also distracts people how they botch COVID and everything else. On the other hand, what really took Biden from just looking crappy to looking disastrous was the Afghanistan debacle. And a military debacle in Afghanistan is one thing. A military debacle in Europe is a whole different order of magnitude. And here's my prediction. If Biden does anything, it will be a debacle.
Right. So maybe it's better that he doesn't do anything, because
Mark Milley's still in charge. Last I saw, he was going around policing pronouns, but he's still the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. In fact, pretty much everybody who botched Afghanistan kept their jobs and will be around to botch the next thing. And at this point, I think we can be pretty confident that that's what they'll do. So my own feeling is we should keep Putin guessing about our response. And I'm not saying there's nothing military that's worth doing, but definitely less is more from the standpoint of troops on the ground, because I'm just not at all confident in the U.S. command structure not screwing it up.
That's a very good point. Let's talk a little bit about Biden and the first year collapse, because I think that's pretty notable. It's not just Biden either. I mean, the Gallup poll about Democratic voter support for Congress was really interesting. This was on Friday, and it showed that Democratic support for Congress, or Democratic approval of Congress, had fallen by more than half over the past year, primarily since the summer. So again, you're dealing with Afghanistan as a potential inflection point, but also the collapse of the two bills that Biden and Schumer and Pelosi have been pushing through. I've never seen anything like this. I've never seen a president collapse during what should be a honeymoon period. But then again, I've never seen a president set expectations so impossibly high that failure was the only option. I mean, this is a guy who is a complete incompetent. And I think all of this is unfolding, unfortunately, fairly predictably.
So Lyndon Johnson came in. He was with a landslide victory in 1964, huge majorities in the House and the Senate, and was able to push through the Great Society and the Civil Rights Act and so on, because he just had so much political clout. Nonetheless, he was a one-termer. After doing stuff that drastic, and also a military botch in Vietnam, he was not able to run for a second term of his own. Biden, however, comes in barely squeaking by and barely holding a majority in the Senate, the narrowest House majority, I think, in history.
First time a first-term president's party has lost seats in the House. Yes. On his election, yeah.
And the conventional wisdom among politicians for the last 200 years would be that in that situation, you kind of play small ball. You look for stuff you could do that even a lot of the opposition voters will approve of. You try to build up some cred and look trustworthy and reliable going to the next elections. The Democrats instead just chose to act as if they had a huge supermajority and to cram through as much as they could. And I've actually pondered why they might do this. One is that they know something I don't, and they feel like they've got a narrow window to get this stuff through, and they've got to get it through now or it's never going to happen. And it's just worth burning all their credibility and all their resources and everything else to try to get this through before the window slams shut. I don't know what that window would be, but the other possibility is that they're just idiots. And there's certainly plenty of evidence for that. As Ed Driscoll likes to say, they've outsourced most of their planning to journalists on Twitter, and that has not worked well for them. Journalists, of course, are, well, what is it Ben Rhodes said, 27-year-olds who literally know nothing.
Right.
So letting them guide you doesn't work. And Twitter, of course, itself is a bubble of people who don't reflect the country as a whole. And in fact, their stuff is quite unpopular with most Democrats. It's unpopular with the minority voters who are usually safe for them, but who don't like woke politics, who, aren't really into socialism and all of this stuff. And it has just really cratered for them. And, you talked about those bills failing to get through. I know the wisdom among the Democratic leadership was, if the bills got through, we'd have a win and our base would love us and we'd do better. I think those bills were terrible bills, and I don't think passing them would have made anybody happier.
No, I don't think they would have stood up either. Especially the, Build Back Better. I don't know that there was anything specifically unconstitutional in Build Back Better. Probably some stuff on the margins, but the basis for that election federalizing bill that they were trying to push through and trying to demolish the filibuster with, most of that probably would have been overturned. The federal constraints on state laws regarding voter ID, for instance, I would almost guarantee you that would have been thrown out of court. So really, I mean, this was a fight. This was a losing fight over a loser of a bill. And they knew for months that it wasn't going to work. They actually had tried this in May, dropped it because it wasn't going to work, which was the right thing to do back then. And then brought it back up again, even though they knew it was going to die after they got embarrassed by the collapse of the Build Back Better negotiations. And that was entirely among Democrats. I mean, I don't even get this as a I don't know, like a moral demonstration sort of vote. I mean, that's what Pelosi can do in the House. When you get to the Senate, you're going to have to start dealing with other issues. And Pelosi can barely do that these days in the House. Nancy Pelosi, speaking of Nancy Pelosi had a very core principle that she would never put a bill or a vote on the floor of the House without knowing that it was going to pass. And for the most part, knowing it would pass with votes from her own party. Mitch McConnell is a little looser than that. He's willing to do a little bit more when he's majority leader. He's willing to do things with some more bipartisanship and put stuff on the floor. But I mean, Chuck Schumer, I don't get that at all. the leadership in this party seems to have just thrown all in with the radicals and are sort of like the Joker, near the end of The Dark Knight, where you got the big pile of money and they set it on fire, and it's just, what was it? Michael Caine said, some men just want to watch the world burn. I mean, it just seems like that's Biden and Schumer these days.
Well, Schumer's supposed to be smart, and he certainly has been canny in other circumstances. And once again, there's a quality of desperation to what the Democrats have been doing that I don't grasp, but I feel like I'm missing something important by not grasping what makes them so desperate now. Traditionally, the left sort of is happy to be incremental and say, well, we'll win something this year, we'll win something next year, we'll nibble our way to what we want without ever getting the great mass of voters upset. And this time they've chosen exactly the opposite approach. And again, what makes it so urgent to do it now?
Right. The other thing too, usually I agree with you on that. Usually their proposals at least speak to some sort of voter discontent, right? None of their stuff this time does. I mean, this is all stuff that is zero priority for voters. And poll after poll after poll shows that people don't really care about the social engineering that they're trying to push through in the reconciliation bill. And voting reform, voting law reform doesn't even show up as a blip on voter on voter priorities. And so
most of that stuff's unpopular. Voters favor voter ID.
Right.
They favor only letting citizens vote. I mean, the Democrats is affirmatively unpopular. So why you go all in on that, I don't know at all. And sure, I can see why they'd like to win on it. I can see why they'd like to have a regime where basically they can gin up as many votes as they need. But the thought that voters were going to like that idea, it just seems absurd to me.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And the only thing that I can think of in terms of strategy is that they see it as sort of the Obamacare strategy, where you slam through something that's not terribly popular and you make it so difficult to undo that you've changed the status quo. Even if you lose the next couple of elections, you've changed the status quo to a certain extent that can't be you can't return to the status quo ante. And I think that that's really what they wanted from Build Back Better. I think that's really what they wanted from this SB1 or SR1, the voting law reform stuff that they're trying to push through, is that they're not even pretending to care about voter priorities. This is really all about what they want to do. And I think voters are catching on to that. You can get away with that in 2010 when you had just about enough votes to get it through, barely. But they didn't have anything near the number of votes here. I mean, just the whole thing makes no sense whatsoever in terms of a party that's looking for some sort of long-term entrenchment in the electorate.
Like I say, the short-term thinking here troubles me a little bit because I do just keep thinking I'm missing some reason they have for thinking that way. And I can't imagine any reason they have for acting that way that would be good. So, I mean, it's all bad. And one thing I will say for people on the right is, you talk about getting in a change that can't be reversed. We are going to see, and it's been known for a long time, we're going to see it at some point in the distant future. Now it's the not so distant future. We're going to see essentially a financial collapse of the U.S. government. Yeah. The debt's, unsustainable, growing so fast. The reason why interest rates are so low is because we couldn't afford to pay even sort of historic interest rates on the debt now. And there's going to come a crisis. And at that point, people on the right need to be prepared to strike and strike hard and eliminate whole government departments and just enact structural change as part of that. That will, in fact, undo 50 plus years of Democratic policies and really change the political landscape afterward. And I don't know if there are enough people on the right willing to be that drastic. We have too many bow tie conservatives who, are at most up for incremental change.
Well, that will be something for a 2024 campaign, because you can't do that without having the White House. And you really need at least majority, as we're learning right now. You need enough of a majority in both chambers of Congress in order to get past that type of reluctance. And I'm not saying that Joe Manchin was unreasonably reluctant. I think he was extremely reasonably reluctant. I think he's seeing the radicalization of his party and dug his heels in accordingly. And I think it was a smart move. And I think Kirsten Sinema did the same thing. We're coming up to the end of the time here. I'll ask you this one question to wrap things up. When do you think Joe Manchin crosses the aisle and becomes a Republican? Because to me, I know people say, "Oh, he'll never do it. He'll never do it." Selena Zito, whose opinion I respect and just personally, I just adore Selena. She's terrific. Insists that Joe Manchin will never do it. She's talked with him, so she's got a better read on this. But I just don't see, with the incentives and disincentives arrayed in front of Joe Manchin, how he stays a Democrat and stays in politics. So I think it's this year. I think at some point this year he flips. But I'm interested to hear what your thoughts are on this.
So I have some friends who are like still old timey Southern Democrats whose views on the issues of the culture should make them Republicans, but who out of just sheer tribal loyalty remain cussedly members of the Democratic Party. And he may be somebody like that. But if you assume he's a rational interest maximizer, he should cut a deal. And this goes for Sinema too, of course, if she thinks of doing it. He should cut a deal now, because once the elections the Republicans retake the Senate, as they're expected to do at least later this year, his bargaining power is way down.
Right.
And the best thing for him to do is to cut a deal with Mitch McConnell. And honestly, it might be smart for he and Sinema to go and cut a joint deal together. They might be able to extract more and keep somebody from playing them off against each other. But if they do that, regardless, we're coming up on the period where their maximum value to the Republicans will let them get some kind of a deal on seniority and other stuff. When people switch parties like that in the Senate, they try to cut a deal that says I'll keep my seniority, or I'll get some plum committee assignments or whatever in exchange for switching over. And maybe he won't go Republican. Maybe he'll just pull a Bernie Sanders and call himself an independent, but caucus with the Republicans, which is just as good. And that he may find that satisfying enough. Honestly, given the way that he and Sinema have been shat on by their fellow Democrats, if it were me, I probably already would have done it, just as an up yours. But politicians are generally more considered than that.
Yes, I agree. All right, Glenn, what's coming up next for you over at Instapundit? Or New York Post, for that matter.
I have to look at my scheduled post to say, what's next? Well, one thing I'm working on, this is not really an Instapundit. Well, it sort of is. I've been touting on Instapundit for years, this idea of what I call a welcome wagon project for people who move to red states from blue states, to basically explain to them, here's why the states you move from suck. Please don't support policies that will make the new place you move to suck like the place you escaped. And I kept saying, someone should do this, someone should do this, someone should do this. About the 30th time I said that, I was like, maybe I should do this. And it's not really, I'm a blogger and a law professor. It's not like at the core of my wheelhouse. But what I did was I reached out to the folks at FEE, the Foundation on Economic Education, because I like their work and it's kind of there. And we talked, and now there's a project underway, and I will confess they're doing virtually all the work on it. I'm in the loop, but and it's called the Fresh Start States Initiative, which is exactly that. It's going to start out with a test operation in the Nashville and Atlanta areas, and then expand outward once everything's refined. And basically, people who move there from New York, California, New Jersey, Illinois, places like that, will get a nice little packet in the mail that says, welcome to Nashville or wherever. And here's some things about your community, and here's some things you should know about why the things that attract most people to this place are the way they are. For example, in Tennessee, we have no income tax, and we like that. And we have various things that explain, saying, if you want things to stay the way they were when they attracted you here, you should probably continue to support the policies that made the place attractive to begin with. And how much good? Well, it'll do some good. Sure. Blog commenters always rain on it because they rain on everything. But is it a magic wand? No, but all politics is a game of the margins, and if you make people who move 10% less blue, that's a big deal.
I agree. And as somebody who just moved in the last 6 months from a blue state to a red state for a variety of reasons, politics wasn't really part of it, but economics certainly was a big part of it. Yeah, absolutely. And I can tell you here in Texas, they're very sensitive to people coming in from blue states and trying to blue up Texas. And yeah, I think that this is a great project for you, and I'm just looking forward at Instapundit.com to read more about it as you and Fee roll that out. Glenn Reynolds, thanks so much for being with us today.
Thank you.